Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Vital Dissent. I'm your host, Patrick MacFarlane. This one is episode 243. Show notes may be found at vitaldissent.com/243. And I'm very glad to be joined by Richard Cox on the show. Richard, how's it going?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me on, Patrick.
Yeah, so you are the co-host with Adam Fitzgerald, who's a favorite guest on this podcast here. And I'm really glad that you had approached me with an email because I had mentioned I was going to do like a deep dive on Kosovo and kind of the history behind Yugoslavia and the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 90s. And you had mentioned that you and Adam had covered this in a series of podcasts maybe a couple of years ago. And I really appreciate you offering to help me tackle this because as we were talking about before we went on the microphone, we went live. You were saying that this is one of the most complicated geopolitical topics to cover. So I really appreciate that.
Well, I hope you appreciate it by the end. It's not just made a hash of it because it's, I wrote that email in a sense as an opportunity to get back into this study of Yugoslavia. This is a good thing to do because, we picked it up in the series with Adam, which was a Roads to 9/11 series. And I don't know if I knew prior to talking to Adam why Yugoslavia was relevant to 9/11, but that was a chance for me to jump into it 4 years ago then. And I suppose that comes out of something of a childhood curiosity because when I was a boy, the two big interventions were in Iraq, where we're going to liberate the Kuwaitis from the evil Saddam Hussein, and that seemed to make sense. And the other, perhaps even more noble aspiration was to bring peace and harmony to this disintegrating Yugoslavia because there was no oil interest there or anything. There was just nothing in it. And that's what the media told us. There was just nothing in it at all for the West, no self-interest whatsoever, all about helping out those poor, blighted people there. So that led a certain curiosity to me. Okay, well, as I became more interested in maybe a slightly more cynical view of Western foreign policy, what really happened there? What was it all about?
Yeah, but before I guess we really dive into the topic, I'll just ask you to, introduce yourself, just kind of a bit of a background, tell the audience who you are and where you're coming from and kind of about your work more generally.
Yeah, so I run a podcast myself, the Deep State Consciousness podcast, which kind of evolved with no clear direction. It was just me deciding I had interesting friends and I should interview them. And then I ran out of friends, so I started interviewing other people. And eventually I met Adam Fitzgerald, and we started doing a lot of geopolitical podcasting together, initially around 9/11, and we've branched out. And Adam now has his quite specific 9/11 podcast, The Darkened Hour, which I help out on. I'm a junior partner there. And that's it. So on the podcast, I cover themes like anarchism. I wrote a book on anarchism last year. Just last year, into the new year, The Essence of Anarchy. And I like to look at geopolitical questions, but also from a kind of philosophical perspective of sometimes asking, where's the line if we look at history between sensible geopolitical analysis and where do we drop off into conspiracy theorizing? So I'm currently going through, I wrote a book on conspiracy theory last year, the sort of philosophy of it, and I'm currently going through 20th century history, the rise of the American empire, Theodore Roosevelt, and the First World War, then the US intervention into that, and the kind of world order that emerges out of that. Treading that line, I think, between sensible analysis and these kind of deeper questions, which maybe are conspiratorial, or maybe it's where we need to be going about things like the Anglo-American establishments. That's my kind of areas of interest and what I explore over on my own podcast.
Yeah, I think it's sorely needed too, because speaking from my own personal experience, getting involved in this space and getting interested in these topics, it's really when you're first in it, you're kind of impressionable and you're a little bit naive. And I think your eyes get open to a lot of things and the mind tends to jump to conclusions or to make these associations where maybe the associations are a bit tenuous and you play jury in your mind, judge, jury, and executioner. And to have people that can influence you and kind of lead you on that journey in a responsible way. Because I think there are things that are conspiracies and there are things that happen behind the scenes, but it discredits the true things that happen to have people out there who are irresponsible with jumping to conclusions and making associations where the evidence just isn't there.
Yeah, and for me, I felt it's important that people who are coming from an anti-war perspective, an anti-imperial perspective, to own that space, okay, and own the space of trying to demark and understand what are positions are based upon, and where it goes into kind of fringe or fanciful or even mythological thinking, and not leave that space to people who want to use conspiracy theory and weaponize it as a way to say, this is all nonsense, nothing to see here, trust your government, citizen.
Right.
It's good for the kind of radicals to own the space of where's the acceptable limit.
Yeah, definitely agreed. And from a more, I guess, selfish perspective, myself being a libertarian, in the libertarian anti-war space, there's a general feeling that, we need to establish ourselves as being the people that own the space, at least from the liberty perspective. And so definitely agree with you there. So turning toward the topic of Kosovo and the breakup of Yugoslavia, I think it's so important for people to understand this, because most Americans, at least Americans of my generation, don't think about it at all. Of course, the 90s are really just overshadowed by the events of September 11th. And we forget about, everything that happened before then. In the 90s are really considered, aside from Iraq War I, they're considered to be, I guess not as much as the 80s, but a period where the United States wasn't involved in these foreign wars. And I'm talking from the perspective of regular Americans who don't know much of anything. And so the way it became relevant to me and why I wanted to cover it is because just recently there has been tensions rising between Serbia and Kosovo again. And to set the stage, basically from 10,000 feet, the United States intervened in basically what was a civil war in the breakup of a country in the 90s, and they intervened against Serbia, who was trying to rein in an errant part of Serbia, Kosovo, or an errant part of Yugoslavia. It gets really technical, but we instigated a NATO US-led bombing campaign in the late 90s in order to intervene in that conflict. And in 2008, Kosovo declares independence officially, and the NATO countries recognize that independence, but many countries across the world, including Russia, didn't. And historically, Russia was on the side of Serbia. And so where this comes into being now is that essentially with the war in Ukraine going on, tensions are flaring up in Serbia again, or they did, and there was the Serbian army was activated and was on standby. Possibly a war might have broken out or could have broken out between Serbia and Kosovo that NATO would have gotten involved in, presumably, and that Russia would have gotten involved in, possibly. And it could have really opened a new front in kind of the global Cold War that we're in right now. So, Richard, do you take umbrage with my recounting or nitpicking?
No, I think it's exactly right that the interventions of the 90s have set up a continuous implied NATO presence in both Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, and that could activate at any time. There's kind of a Pax Americana, I suppose, that in some way stops these things breaking out. But if there's ever any weakness in that, ethnic tension could just flare up there again in an instant. You would think that would be the case at some point in the future, that there's going to be challenges. And right now seems to be hot for it in both of those places.
And I really identified, there's such an extensive history here that, we're just going to scratch the surface on here today. And for people who know nothing about this, as I knew very little about it, even a month ago, to kind of get that, it's so complicated. But as I was going through it, I noticed so many parallels to the situation in Ukraine, especially with this ethnic divide. Not to say that Ukraine was constituted the same way that Yugoslavia was, but this idea of sections of the country seceding, but there being minorities within the seceding part who don't want to go along with that secession. And the parallel is with, in 2014 with the Maidan coup, the Donbass seceding from Ukraine, not wanting to go along with that. And so there's just similarities there.
Yeah, and it really makes me think about this idea of secession, really, because I think it's in some ways the most interesting political idea out there, because we're not going to live in Ancapistan anytime in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So I think in some ways, the way you could see liberty achieved is this concept of a Europe of 1,000 Liechtensteins, where some would be utterly communist, but some really would be tending towards Ancapistan. However, secessionist movements have all this problem, right? That as soon as you secede, there's a bloc in the new country that doesn't want to, and it's going to either break off or join the previous one, and then that secedes, and well, that creates a new bloc. So it's also a recipe for endless conflict. So just on that kind of philosophical point, I suppose the breakup of Yugoslavia makes me question how secession could be a healthy thing, how it could be achieved in a healthy way.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And more parallels I identified was, of course, within Kosovo itself. So in the same way that, right, Ukraine is the native home maybe of the Rus people, where the Russian Empire really started in Kiev, and then they were driven out and they settled around Moscow. And so a lot of Russians see Kiev as being the home of their state. In the same way, Serbians see Kosovo as the home of their people in their state. A lot of their, founding holy lands they exist in Kosovo. And so when Kosovo was settled and conquered by ethnic Albanian Muslims, there were a lot of there were a lot of Serbians who were still in Kosovo who identified as Serbian and didn't want to go along with the secession. And a lot of the tension revolves around the treatment of ethnic Serbians that are still living in Kosovo. And the same was true of Bosnia, which was another part of Yugoslavia a bit earlier in the 90s. There were a series of wars along the breakup of Yugoslavia itself. And so I really saw that parallel between the Serbians and Kosovo and the Russians in Kiev and Ukraine.
Yeah. So how do you want to just cover the history of Yugoslavia for a moment?
I think we should. Yeah. And I'll bring up the map so people can really kind of wrap their head around this. So here we go. I guess let's go back to the formation of Yugoslavia itself.
Yeah, the country comes together after the First World War. So you've got the Ottoman Empire, which is on the losing side and retreating out of Europe. And that's been, I think Serbia became independent sometime in the 1870s. And then on the other side, the Austrian Empire collapses, and that leaves Croatia now separate. And the concept behind Yugoslavia is a union of the South Slavic people. And this is an idea that goes back to the 1700s, the idea that we, the South Slavs, are always being pushed around by these big imperial forces, East and West. But if we had a unity, if we could come together as one, we could build something that would stand up to them. And that idea wins out. But there's also, of course, like a separatist nationalist current there of the Croats who want to go their own way, the Slovenians who want to go their own way, and maybe think that Yugoslavia is just Serbs' oppression of them now. They're new masters. So there's that tension inherent within it. And it goes along to the Second World War, where Hitler initially signs a peace agreement with them because he needs to cover his southern flank to go into Russia. And that then falls apart. There's a British-induced coup, and Hitler allies with the nationalist Croats, who engage in massive levels of ethnic cleansing against the Serbs. Hundreds of thousands died. There's a particularly brutal concentration camp there. And even the Nazis were kind of shocked in the way Croats went about the violence against the Serbs. Stuff that it sounds like propaganda. It sounds like competitions to see how many throats you could cut in one night. I'm sorry to be disgusting, but It sounds like, this must be made up. But it seems this level of ethnic hatred emerged. And it comes the other way too. There are nationalist Serbs who are ethnically cleansing areas of Croats as they're fighting the Nazis. They're spending more time doing that. Eventually, it's the communist partisans that win out and free the country from Hitler's fascism. And out of that, Josip Broz, or better known as Tito, emerges as the leader. And he really rules the country then from the end of the Second World War up until his death in 1980. Somehow, out of all this violence, they managed to form a country which is seemingly reasonably functioning. And I think there's a strong left-right divide here, because a lot of the people who are very interested in Yugoslavia on the anti-war side are coming from a very left-wing perspective, and they see it as a workers' paradise. They see this mixed economy where the state had a hand in the factories. There was factories would be run on the basis of votes from workers, and so that they have a very positive view of this being kind of idyllic. And a more kind of economically free market critique would be that actually it was all just fueled as a debt bubble. The West would put money in to sustain it because it was a bulwark against Russia. So Yugoslavia is non-aligned. Tito told Stalin to go do one and threatened to have him assassinated when Stalin sent assassins into Belgrade. So he really stood up to Stalin. And whilst the West, obviously the CIA does not like non-aligned countries at all, but they thought if they threw Yugoslavia up in the air, it would probably land on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain. So they left it alone and Western money came pouring in. When interest rates shot up in 1980, the same year Tito died really, there's a double blow. The figurehead is gone. And also now Yugoslavia cannot repay its debts. And it starts to go into really a debt spiral, which brings in the IMF, which starts imposing its austerity measures. And I think here you have agreement between left and right, maybe for slightly different reasons, that the IMF's policies were the foundation of the breakup of Yugoslavia, because they start cutting all the social services back and at the same time raising taxes. So now, where people used to have a good standard of living, suddenly they start asking questions like, well, why am I a Slovene? Why am I a Croat paying all this money when I don't get my services anymore? And it's going down to the poorer provinces like Kosovo. So you also have politicians then who are trying to make names for themselves. Slobodan Milosevic is amongst them, for really fueling ethnic hatred and using it as a way to step up the political ladder. And you have this rise of nationalist ideology in Croatia and Slovenia, and in Serbia too, I suppose. Here you get a bit of a chicken and egg thing as to who was really the first person to rise the nationalist stakes that set everything else off. And I think people tend to start their Yugoslavia stories depending on who they want to blame. Because if you want to think the Croats are to blame for it all, you say, well, they started arming themselves and tried to secede, and then the Serbs defended themselves. But if you want to think the Serbs, you say, well, the Serbs became belligerent first, and that drove the Croats in that direction. But ultimately, the Croats and the Slovenians secede. Slovenia is ethnically very homogenous, so that went without too much trouble. It's a 10-day war. And Croatia has a huge Serb population. So the Serbs said, well, if you can secede from Yugoslavia, we will secede from Croatia. And then you have a disagreement around, do these nations secede on national borders or on ethnic borders? And there's no obvious answer to that, right? So it leads to just fantastic levels of violence and ethnic cleansing. And that then flows into Bosnia and Herzegovina with similar results. Now, the international angle on this sort of anti-imperialist line would be that the United States is in the background, along with European powers, encouraging this. So the US ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, interesting character, he when the Croatians start importing weapons from Hungary and probably Germany, he suggests that the US government would be very, very unhappy if the Yugoslav central government went in and took the weapons off them. So if you can look at that and say it's fomenting a war. Similar in Bosnia, when Alija Izetbegovic comes to a peace agreement to divide Bosnia into cantons where people can kind of live peacefully. He then has a meeting. Everyone agrees on this, and he then has Izetbegovic is the Muslim leader there. He has a meeting with Warren Zimmerman. He walks out of the meeting and says the deal's off. And it was indicated to him that if he just declared independence and tried to take over, he would get support from the US in some way, which they did by allowing the Mujahideen to come in. They used this is where it links into 9/11, because some of the players there were in Yugoslavia at the time. So the CIA and the Pentagon stopped facilitating the importation of radical Islamists into Bosnia then, and started training and funding them, and they act as like shock troops. Then it's on. It's full blown civil war now as the country breaks up.
Yeah, and there's a whole lot to unpack there, and I think you did a great job summing up, 6 or 7 decades of history here. But it seemed to go back to like the kind of where Russia ties into this, after World War II, that you have these communist partisans really being the force that defeats and expels the Nazis. But the other connection here to where Russia comes into it is that the Russian people are Slavic as well. And I mean, is it fair to say that they see the Southern Slavs as being brothers in a way?
Historically, I think there's a certain internal pressure in Russia to look after the Southern Slavs. And you take this back to the First World War, that it starts off because of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Bosnia. Austria are very unhappy with the way the Serbians are examining the issue, and they don't think they're going to get much justice there. So they want to go in and take over the police investigation. And Russia said, "Oh, we are the defenders of the Serbs, so we can't allow this at all." So they very, very cynically, I think, come to the Serbs' aid at that point, because they know it's going to spark a wider war, and that they're going for the for the Straits by Turkey there, so they can get access to the Black Sea. But yeah, cynically and also probably uncynically, yeah, the Russians do see themselves as the defenders of the Slavic people, being Slavs themselves. Yeah.
Now, the Croat, is it fair to say, and I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but is it fair to say that the Slovenes, the Croats, and the Serbs are all Slavs?
Yeah, they are.
And then the Bosnians and the Albanians are more Muslims.
The Bosnians are Muslims, but they're Muslim Slavs. So I think that a lot of the Muslims in Bosnia are actually Serbs. So, and this is where it gets complicated. So the Croats are Catholics, okay, and the Catholic Church was like really backing their genocide in the 1940s. That's another factor.
Right.
The Serbs are Eastern Orthodox, and a lot of the Bosnians are Muslims, but they are converts to Islam. So they're European Muslims, essentially. They're converts, because when the Ottoman Empire went in, it was easier to be a Muslim, essentially. So that's the breakup. But it gets more complicated, because at some point, Muslim became considered to be an ethnic group, just to balance up the tables in there. So that's, there's ethnicities and also a religion that is considered an ethnic group.
Yeah. And where this ties back into the 1500s, and we'll just go there briefly, is that there was a great battle that took place in Kosovo between the Serbians and the Albanian Muslims. Is that correct to say?
Yeah, Ottoman Empire came in 1389, and Kosovo it literally means in the Slavic language, the field of the black birds, and that's like a big thing in Serbian identity, that they had, even though they lost, that they made this heroic stand against the mighty Ottoman Empire in Kosovo. And yeah, as you say, it's like their cultural homeland, with all the monasteries that go back to the Middle Ages and that kind of thing. So they were very attached to it. But also there was just a rising Albanian population there. So the demographic shifted throughout the 20th century there.
I guess for Americans to visualize this battle, the Field of Blackbirds happened. It was like the Alamo, kind of like that. And the Alamo times, I don't know, 3,000 for these people, for the Serbians. And another thing that flared up tensions and has in the last few decades, and one thing that, of course, Justin Raimondo wrote extensively about this conflict in the 90s, and I'll include a link. If you go to his archives at antiwar.com, you can see what he called to be his war journal. Let's see here. And so all of his works from that time are linked here. And I'll include a link. It's not a straightforward link. It's like antiwar.com/Justin/JustinArchives.html. And so if you go back, you can read, all of his almost daily columns from that time chronicling the NATO intervention. And so another thing I wanted to tie in more personally for this audience, and for me being the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute, was the birth of antiwar.com really happening during this intervention and the coverage. And if you go back and listen to the interview that I did with Eric Garris, you'll hear how intimate and integral the NATO intervention in Kosovo was to the founding of antiwar.com. And so I was writing a piece, and I'm still trying to write a piece, where it said, like, basically the title of the piece is, Justin had a piece before he died, and a few months before he died, called "In the Beginning There Was Kosovo." And I wanted to write a piece called "Does It All End in Kosovo?" talking about essentially, antiwar.com began in Kosovo. World War I began in not Kosovo, but in was it in Belgrade? No, it wasn't Belgrade. Yeah. Sarajevo.
Well, yeah, but also it was the Austrians going into Belgrade, so it's pretty close.
Yeah, right. And so, but tying it into World War III, I'll call it just offhandedly, like, does another conflict in Kosovo, in Serbia, kick off World War III and tie that all together? Because there's so many of these parallels that are just so interesting.
Well, and kind of mirroring there, interestingly, is I hadn't realized that anti-war was so connected to Yugoslavia and Kosovo. Anti-war's right, but it's also really the rise of the doctrine of humanitarian intervention.
Right.
Okay, like, obviously that had been around before, back in the days of the Spanish-American War. That was the justification, but it really became codified almost as this new reason. If you read like Samantha Power's book, it's the failings of Rwanda and the failings to stop the massacre masculine ethnic cleansing, genocide, whatever you call it, at Srebrenica, and then the apparent success of the NATO mission in Bosnia and the apparent success of the mission in Kosovo for protecting the Albanian people, that launches this idea that we can go out onto the world stage confident in a monopolar world order. The US can act to stop atrocities, because certainly, the people like Samantha Power in her book, The Problem from Hell, and the humanitarian intervention crowd, don't see this the way Justin Raimondo sees it. They see this as a thriving success, a wonderful humanitarian endeavor that saved hundreds of thousands of people and stood up to and said no to brutal, violent dictators. And you're not going to get away with this in the future. So it's interesting that both those things spawned very strongly from Yugoslavia.
And I'm really glad you mentioned that, because I failed to mention it. But I was going to write about, that's part of my column too that I'm working on that's just taking forever. Because I feel like I need to know everything there is to know about something before I write about it, which really gets in the way of putting things out. But the other part of that too, Richard, is the beginning of, really the hallmark, not the high water mark, but of NATO not being a defensive alliance anymore. And that really, really marking NATO's expanse eastward. And I know there were things that precipitated this that happened before the NATO intervention in Kosovo. But at that point in time, it really was more so of the mask coming off in a way. And so soon after the fall of the USSR, it's only NATO began intervening in 1994, right? In Bosnia, was that the first intervention?
Yeah, there were UN peacekeepers before that, but that was depends. It kind of depends. Officially, yes, but the CIA and the Pentagon were shipping the radical Islamists in for that, and they were making sure the Croatians were well supplied as well. There was more than, I think, the Europeans that supplying the Croatians, but the US Army then got involved in training them for this Operation Storm, where they would ethnically cleanse Croatia of Serbs. So there was covertly, they were involved all along. And of course, if you want to go back a bit further, you could say that the whole thing's a planned takedown. So you take out all the state-run apparatus of the economy, and Western firms can go in and buy it up for pennies on the dollar then. So yeah, it's hard to put an exact start point, but yeah, officially, that's right. Yeah.
No, I think that's great. And so then going back to, so I read, was it To Kill a Nation, that one of the book suggestions that you gave to me. I only made it about halfway through before, we had our record time. But it seems like, at least from the other perspective, and the author, I believe, of that book he's a professor in the United States, but I think he has more of a take on, or there was another documentary that you suggested to me too that I watched.
Probably Weight of Chains.
Yes. Yeah. And that seemed like, it was actually made by a Serb. And so there's this huge demonization in the West of the Serbs, especially in that conflict, as being the only perpetrators of ethnic cleansing. And I'm not saying that everything that happened there was, all hunky dory, but it does seem like a lot of the Serbian atrocities were put out of context, either or lied about or exaggerated. And again, I'm not saying that nothing bad happened, but there were all sides that were committing atrocities in this conflict. But did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, to me, this is the most difficult area of it. When I look, I tend to think that the complaints about the Serbs are probably more true in terms of, I know the people back 20 years ago, perhaps quite rightly, questioned the numbers at Srebrenica, where the Serbs are meant to have killed 8,000. I could be dead wrong about this, and maybe one of your audience members will tell me why, but I tend to think the further investigations and DNA testing has indicated that there was kind of a high body count there, and the Serbs did go wild. And that would be in keeping with, Yugoslav history and in general what was going on. It is certainly the case that Croats engaged in massive levels of ethnic cleansing too. 200,000 Serbs were driven out of Croatia. And there's a lot of obfuscation around this, right? Like the Croats would say, well, we didn't drive those people out. The Serb military told them to go. But you don't have to kill that many people before the rest of the population gets the message of what's coming for them and they flee, right? So that these things are obfuscated. So I do think there was like an incredible level of violence going on there. One of the things that brought NATO in were there were like 3 bombing incidents in markets in a market in Sarajevo, and there's certainly, I think, credible reason to believe that they could have been false flags carried out by the Mujahideen fighters, maybe, because it's just the timing of them. A bit like the gas in Syria, that like, well, this is the line. If you cross this line,
right.
At the same time, the Serbs were shelling Sarajevo heavily, so I don't want to abscond them of blame for that. They were entirely brutal. Yeah.
And we're talking about certain Mujahideen groups too as well. Is there any relation between that and the Kosovo Liberation Army that was supported by the United States? Are they one and the same, or is that 2 different groups?
I wish Adam was here now. I'm not aware of like super direct connect. Well, yeah, I think there are connections, okay, in terms of both having contacts with, but I don't know to the extent the Mujahideen fighters were brought into Kosovo.
Okay, yeah. But I mean, another document.
Sorry, both received funding from Saudi Arabia. So in that kind of way, there would be, the Islamic world was keen to pour money in. Supposedly Iran, although who knows what to believe when anyone says Iran funds anything, because Iran, if you stub your toe, probably Iran funded that, right? So
sure.
I never know of that one. But Saudi Arabia certainly was funding as a way of gaining a foothold in Bosnia, and then with the Kosovo Liberation Army.
Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. The best way to do that, guys, is to go to libertyweekly.club. Yes, I haven't changed the URL yet, but this is my membership website that also functions as a newsletter. So if you go to that website, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, and you can subscribe for the free newsletter, and I send out a lot of free content. However, there is a section in those free emails that is premium, and that premium section includes early access to my episodes, access to bonus episodes, and preprints of my articles before they're published at the Libertarian Institute or other outlets. So again, go to the website, hit subscribe in the top right-hand corner, and sign up for that email list. You go through the page here and you can see all the content that I've set out in the past. There's a whole bunch of it, guys, and you get access to those previous emails that have gone out as well. Another way to help support me is to go to vitaldissent.com/stitchfix and sign up through my link there. You'll get $25 off your first order, and I will also get a $25 credit. Guys, I use this to buy my wardrobe. I'm a father of 2. I have my own business. I do this, and I don't have time to go shopping. Can't haul the wife and kids around to have a leisurely shop for myself to pick these clothes. So what Stitch Fix does is that they pick the clothes for you. They send them to you in fixes, and it's really awesome stuff. These are all the pieces that I personally have bought myself. There's a lot of work stuff in there, but there's also casual stuff. I got an awesome plaid shirt that's in there, a flannel, really love that. I got this really cool sweatshirt. I got these awesome boots and a nice windbreaker, really good stuff. So go on over to vitaldissent.com/stitchfix. You can also get Vital Dissent, really hard not to say Liberty Weekly, Vital Dissent merchandise with the cool, awesome new logo from Mises Pieces. You can get all these kinds of things, all this merch. You got coffee cups, pint glasses, sweatshirts, premium t-shirts, premium sweatshirts, all that good stuff there at vitaldissent.com/merch. Also, guys, I started a TikTok channel, and I think that'll be really cool, trying to get more eyeballs on this content and more views. You can see it's already garnering a bunch of views, where I do anti-war cartoon reviews and a lot of cool stuff there. So vitaldissent.com/TikTok is where you can find me. My handle is at Pat MacFarlane _, the same as my Twitter handle. Okay, guys, that's about it. Check out those things. Please help support this content. Help me pay my producer and make the show better for you guys. Thanks. One of the other documentaries that I've attempted to watch it maybe 16 times. It's called, I think it's called Kosovo, The Chronology of Genocide. And it has interviews with a whole bunch of figures, Milosevic and Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright and some Russian officials as well. And then there was, I'm forgetting his name. I think he was an undersecretary who who had his picture taken with the KLA very kind of earlier on in the 90s, and it was a big controversy because at that point it was just a blatant representation that the US was involved in the KLA. And at that time they hadn't undergone their transformation from their transformation to like a real legitimate military force, at least in the eyes of the West. But the other part I heard, in terms of these crimes against, I don't know if you could call them, these atrocities that took place, Milosevic would say, well, it wasn't the Serbian military that did that. It was groups, unofficial, like groups beyond my control of just, third-party actors. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I have. Again, like the audience might correct me, because I think the hardest thing of this whole thing is attributing atrocities. Okay,
right.
Certainly can't say that. On the military, yeah, but they were there were Serb nationalist groups, certainly, but they were working hand in hand with the military. And I as far as whether the Serb military were acting brutally in both Bosnia and Kosovo, it might be that the ultra Serb nationalists were the worst of the worst for committing atrocities. So I tend not to attempt to downplay the level of Serb committed atrocities, because it's almost like, well, what if they were that high? Would that then justify a US intervention? But what you don't hear on probably like documentaries heard, or certainly from Bill Clinton or Madeleine Albright or the proponents of the humanitarian intervention, is the extent to which the US is fanning the flames in Bosnia by telling Igor Bevezic to not sign up for the cantonization treaty, the Treaty of Lisbon, or then flying in the Mujahideen. And also there's this massive prepping and training and supplying of the KLA, who were a criminal organization, at least into the late 80s. So suddenly they're not anymore. Suddenly they're freedom fighters. And so their policy was to go in and shoot police officers and cause chaos in Kosovo to provoke a response then against the civilian population from the Serb army. And that seemed to work quite effectively. They seemed good at provoking those kind of responses, and which would result in massacres then. The difficulty of talking about Serb ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, and was there this plan to drive all the Albanian Kosovars out? A lot of it was based on a document that seems to have been forged called Operation Horseshoe, which the German intelligence agency got from the Bulgarians. And you'll hear a lot of like pro-NATO people, pro-intervention people talking about this entirely uncritically, as if they uncovered this secret document. So it was called Horseshoe because the Serb forces would surround the Albanians like a horseshoe and drive them out. That seems to be a forgery. Okay, there's certainly no proof that was true. What happened was when the airstrike started after the Ramburi agreements, should probably talk about them, that allowed for a greater level of ethnic cleansing of Serbia of Kosovo by the Serbian forces then. Again, there's muddy water, because if there's airstrikes falling on you, you're going to flee anyway. And the NATO did kill Albanians by airstriking them. So that would be one reason to get out. There's like a similar number of people fled from Belgrade because of the airstrikes there. It might be the case that the Kosovo Liberation Army pressured people to leave for photo opportunities. But I do think the most credible reason was the Serbian army, when the airstrikes started raining down, went on the rampage and really took it out on the Kosovo population. I think that's probably the case. It's probably also the case that a lot of Serbs in Kosovo throughout the 70s and 80s had a hard time with certain elements of the Albanian population. There was certainly a drive going way, way back to take Kosovo and make it purely Albanian. So I do think it's coming in both directions. It's just at a certain point, the Serbian army had the majority of the guns. So.
And then, of course, it just really makes you wonder exactly what the U.S. could do in that situation that wouldn't make the problem worse in some way. And one thing, I think the documentary, like a chronology of genocide, I don't know if towards the end it really focuses on the civilian casualties caused by the NATO air campaign. But, of course, that's you were talking earlier about the West's involvement and the United States' involvement in fanning the flames of this situation by arming groups and importing fighters and doing things like that. But then the final involvement, just a direct bombing campaign that, of course, destroyed civilian areas.
Yeah, it wasn't intended as a humanitarian thing. I don't think that's really plausible because everyone acknowledged, even Wesley Clark, who's the US commander there, said you can't really enforce like a humanitarian operation with airstrikes. It's just going to, so it really kicked off the case in the same way people say about the start of the Second World War, really enabled the Holocaust. If it hadn't, so the justification for the Second World War is, of course, well, we had to stop Hitler, but actually it didn't. It enabled him to kill millions of Jews. And in the same way in Kosovo, if you accept that the Serbians were committing all the violence, and I'm not saying that's wrong, but the airstrikes enabled it because all the international observers had to be withdrawn. Very dangerous when NATO were dropping bombs on your head. So that enabled the justification from the case someone like Samantha Power, the great humanitarian interventionist, would make is that the Serbs were slowly ethnically cleansing Kosovo. And if we hadn't intervened, they would have got there in the end and they would have killed 100,000 and driven out hundreds of thousands. So in that way, it's justified. That's pretty tenuous. And the other problem with it is when the ethnic Albanians came back in, they then ethnically cleansed Kosovo of Serbians, and 250,000 Serbians had to flee. So it's not really incorrect to say NATO went to war to ethnically cleanse Kosovo of Serbs, because that was the result. The ending agreement was Milosevic would withdraw his soldiers from Kosovo and peacekeepers would go in, but they didn't stop the ethnic cleansing then. It's probably also worth talking about, if there's probably time, the way the thing kicked off in Kosovo, the Rambui Accords.
Yeah.
I mean, just if there's any part of this which is just pure naked imperialism. So the US delegation put down these accords that said that they were basically designed. There's no way Yugoslavia at the time, Serbia, could have signed them. There's no way Milosevic could have agreed, because it allowed NATO peacekeepers uninhibited access to not just Kosovo, but the entirety of Serbia. And they could take over any kind of industry or transport system or telecommunication system without payment. They would be immune from prosecution. Any Serbian they employed would be immune from prosecution. It was like a complete and total surrender. And it's very clear they did that just so Milosevic would reject it and the Kosovo Albanians would accept it. And then they could say, well, and it was all kept secret for months afterwards. So to make Milosevic look like really an unreasonable partner, there was no way to negotiate a path out of this. And in the end, when Milosevic did ultimately surrender, some people say it was under threat of like extensive bombing of Belgrade, whether that's true or not. But the NATO troops did not get access to Serbia, so NATO just backed down on that thing. So they didn't need to hold; they'd already got what they wanted. So yeah, really, if there's one part of this which is pure naked imperialism, that would be it, where the mask slips, if you like, and you can say, oh, okay, this has been the game all along.
Yeah, and I mean, we have echoes of this happening right now. I'm just trying to look at, here's a report from the 26th of December talking about the recent standoff, and to get into that, the situation, of course, since Kosovo declared independence in 2008, there's a rump, if you will, of 50,000 Serbians that still live in northern Kosovo who rejected the secession, and still would like to remain part of Serbia, except they're on the wrong side of the line, right? And so since 2008, the Kosovo government has been trying to basically, exercise its not territorial integrity per se, but to exercise its dominion over the land that it claims and the people that it claims to be part of Kosovo, and including these 50,000 Serbians. So what the biggest fight has been, that the Kosovar government is trying to force these 50,000 Kosovar Serbians, to adopt driver's licenses and license plates that are Kosovar and not Serbian. And so there's been a big fight about this. I think even more so than just the logistics of it, it is the symbology of it in the exercise of dominion and authority over the Kosovar Serbians. And in the past few months, the institution of this license plate change has been postponed over and over and over again. And now, Kosovo, I think they postponed it from last fall, and it was going to be imposed in December. Well, to And I might be wrong about the timeline on that, but it came to a head just this December when a bunch of Kosovar Serbians set up roadblocks along major highways between Serbia and in Kosovo rather. And there was a big standoff because, of course, it was inhibiting trade and doing all these different things. And the Serbian military activated, and I believe they were asking for clearance either from the EU to send troops into Kosovo. And so Kosovo then officially applies to join the EU. But where this all comes through is the West, a stand down kind of came when it was reported that the West issued an ultimatum to Serbia. And so we're really just in that same place.
Yeah. And this is going to, I mean, I just wrote the number plate thing. It could be a security concern as well, because you can't drive around Kosovo and Serbia in the wrong area with the wrong number plates. It's dangerous. Like in the north of Ireland, it was dangerous to drive around certain places with southern plates, certainly until quite recently. And that's a thing there. So you see cars without any number plates on, or cars that take their number plates off when they're going into a different area, because there's foot patrols of citizens who try and keep people in their own area there and maybe inflict violence if you go into the wrong one, because it's of the history, they're concerned about knowing who's who in the area. So that could be a factor with it.
Of course. Yeah. And I think to clarify myself, Vucic, he's the leader of Serbia, asked NATO's KFOR peacekeepers for permission to deploy up to 1,000 Serbian troops and police officers in Kosovo, as it is entitled to do under UN Security Council Resolution 1244, which put an end to the NATO bombing of the former Yugoslavia in 1999. Of course, these plans were resisted by the U.S. So there were shots fired. On Sunday, KFOR said shots had been fired near a NATO patrol in northern part of Kosovo, close to the roadblocks, adding that there were no casualties and stopped short of assigning blame. But Serbian media, citing witnesses, claim that the incident took place when Kosovo's special forces attempted to clear barricades near a town of Zubin Potok. I don't know. It's just, it seems like the situation is just very close to actual violence taking out. Of course, there was, a bit of a resolution, but that doesn't mean that tensions are just going away. They'll crop up again. Yeah,
there's no end. I suppose you could say what could ultimately resolve the situation in Ukraine. I mean, I'm not sure, really. It just looks to me like these conflicts run through history, and how do they stop? I mean, I suppose Britain and France and Germany stopped because they were kind of brought inside Pax Americana. So yeah, it would become like two counties fighting now. But every time you bring countries inside the empire, you create another boundary of outsideness. And we're seeing that now. So Yugoslavia was the boundary, and there's been something of a peace there for 20 years because it was brought inside. But now Ukraine is a new boundary. So there's an attempt to bring that inside, and that instantly creates a tension when it's pulled in both directions. So yeah, to me, it doesn't look like there's a solution that's going to emerge for this anytime soon.
Yeah, and then even so, in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's so many people asking, what is the end game? What does the end game look like? And if neither side can be defeated, basically, because what's going to happen then?
Yeah, well, that's the parallel with Bosnia, right? The US offered all this support to Bosnia, and the victims of that were the Muslim government of Bosnia, Izetbegovic, and the victims of that were the Muslim people then, because when you've got the backing of a superpower, you can just carry on and on and on. And that's like the case in Ukraine, of course. It will be fought to the last Ukrainian.
Yeah. And so one thing that was that stuck out to me in To Kill a Nation was the author was talking about how even humanitarian interventionists admit that Yugoslavia did exist in a state of relative ethnic harmony. Now, I know there's a big thing about Tito's reign where he did suppress nationalist sentiment because he basically governed in a feeling of Southern Slav brotherhood, right? But when nationalist elements popped up, he would squash them. but there does seem to be, a lot of nostalgia for the times of Tito, I guess because things were going well. But then at the same time, it did seem like, there's an argument to be made that this ethnic tension is the fault of intervention, or at very least the fault of, the debt enslavement of the country by Western powers.
Yeah, I think there's general agreement that accentuated. Additionally, the CIA kept a relationship with nationalist Croats throughout the Cold War. The idea being, we want Yugoslavia to stay together. However, if it goes behind the Iron Curtain at any point after Tito dies or whatever, then we have the hardcore nationalist Ustasha to call upon to disrupt and break up the country.
Yeah.
It's similar. It's kind of a Gladio operation, like they maintained connections to the fascists in Italy in case Italy ever went communist. So they had that as an option. And it's not a coincidence that Yugoslavia broke down at the exact moment it being unified stopped being useful to the American empire. So those people were probably called upon at that point then to enact the breakdown.
And it's just interesting, I wouldn't call myself, of course, an expert of all these different, I don't know if you want to call them proxy kind of battles where, but you see the same formula play out across country and by country and country that the U.S. is involved in, that you have these sleeper agents, or at least the United States allying with these certain factions within a country meant to destabilize that country, or to act as sleepers in the event that we can call upon them when needed. I can think of, you mentioned Gladio, and then there's Ukraine, but we see it here in Bosnia, and then we see it again. Just all over the place, but specifically I've studied the Uyghurs and ETIM in Xinjiang and in Afghanistan a little bit too. But there's so many, pick your country. I wish I knew more about South America and Central America, those interventions too, because I'm sure those fingerprints are all over the place.
Yeah, well, there is a Yugoslavia connection actually. The man the US sent in as head of the peace monitors in Kosovo was a William Walker, who was a veteran of El Salvador, where I shouldn't laugh, but after the Rechat massacre, Walker talked about, I've seen terrible violence in Central America, but this is just off scale. And so you've seen terrible violence because you were the one supporting it there. You were supporting the El Salvadorian government against the rebels and supporting the Nicaraguan Contras. You worked in Honduras and El Salvador supporting that. So they brought a veteran in of the pacification campaigns in Central America to run the show in Kosovo then.
And it seems like there's always this element of, I don't know, depending on which side the United States supports, we're only supposed to care about one side and it seems like lately, at least with Ukraine, we only care because it's a white population, right? But I'm just trying to think too that doesn't stand up either, because I would assume that the Muslim Albanians are not white, right? Or maybe I'm ignorant. I don't know.
No, they are fairly white. Yeah.
Are they? Okay.
Because I'm not entirely sure where. I think ethnically they are European going way back, and they imported the Islam from the Ottoman Empire there, and certainly true of the Bosnians. They are very very European looking people. Where I think the white thing falls down, I think it's definitely there to a degree, right? That in some ways we're hardwired to feel compassion for people who seem more similar to us for all sorts of evolutionary and group psychological reasons. But nobody cared about the people in eastern Ukraine prior to the Russian invasion. Like the fact that 14,000 of them had died since 2014, they were all white, right? And nobody cared. So the idea that your race is someone going to buy you protection from empire or buy you some extra sympathies, it's not true.
Yeah. And it is interesting. Like I'm not someone who really fixates on race, because like going through my liberal arts education at the University of Minnesota, it's like it seems like they always try to give you a Marxian analysis of everything. Like, well, let's divide this piece and look at it from a gender, lens, or a class lens, or a racial lens, or something like that. And so I'm not saying that those analyses aren't appropriate ever, or I'm not saying they're appropriate all the time, but it is interesting to take a look at well, there's no rhyme or reason behind it aside from who is going to give us leverage from the point of the West, who's going to give us leverage, and who are we going to support that will support our interests. That's all it is.
Yeah. And historically, other races have been made into kind of white men when they've wanted to be brought on board. So the Tutsi, when which one was it, the Belgians or the Germans are supporting them, was the Germans supporting them. They elevated them to the level of white people in Rwanda. So they
I see, yeah.
And the Japanese were called honorary Aryans when Theodore Roosevelt favored them and wanted to use them as a proxy force to move into China. So yeah, you can get a promotion to being white if needs be without disrupting the racial hierarchy.
I suppose where the racial element does come in then is when it's convenient for your objectives in the area. And how do we sell the intervention to the public that cares or knows about it? And the best way to do that is to make whoever we're fighting alongside of or aiding appear more like them.
Yeah. And I think that has to do with wealth as well. I actually think we tend to think people who are wealthy are more like us. By wealthy, I don't mean millionaires. I just mean people who have a good standard of living. Because certainly when the empire goes to war with impoverished countries, there's definitely a feeling of, what are the lives worth anyway? They're not, having a good time, are they? So might as well try and break a few eggs and make an omelette out of it.
Yeah.
I definitely think that's a factor. It's just an observation of it.
So, I mean, in a way, I hope that we've given the listeners kind of a crash course on the whole situation, that, that the audience can watch this and have a better idea of where this puzzle piece fits in. But to zoom out a little bit, and I don't know how much you've paid attention or focused on kind of the global geopolitical picture, but I've talked, in the last few interviews just about how there just seems to be escalation everywhere. And it seems that there's so many different fronts opening up along this global Cold War. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a bit too big a question for me in some ways, but I suppose you see the reassertion of Russia and China as a rising world power, and then you're seeing that period of a monopolar world order kind of slipping away, and that's giving rise to all sorts of tension. I would suggest that's the overarching narrative.
Yeah. That's kind of been my thought too. I mean, focusing on, of course, there's the situation in Ukraine. I mean, it was Ukraine and then China. Well, Iran was always there. But it was those three. And then now it just seems like this could be another front or flashpoint that's opening up. And with everything you see, Finland and Sweden, their bids to join NATO extends the front by literally thousands of miles. I don't know. It's an interesting time to live in.
I think tell me if you agree or disagree with this. I think on a level of human consciousness, something's shifted in the cynicism of warfare and the kind of anti-nuclear, we should move towards peace that existed in the Cold War, where there was more of a sense of us and them with the government. Like the government was a bad entity over there that was doing things like smashing up Vietnam. And we, the people, are over here and want them to stop doing that. That seems to have diminished, right? And there's definitely been a cultivated sense that we're on the same team now and we're going out to create peace and justice and harmony in the world. And actually, it would be a good thing if these military alliances like NATO expanded, because they are now the good guys. We are now the good guys. So Yugoslavia is a massive part of that, because a lot of the anti-war, actually it was far more pushed by the Democratic Party than by the Republicans. And in Britain, it's really when the Labour Party came in 97, that was the Kosovo intervention. And with Labour, a lot of the people pushing it had been really anti-war in the past. Elements of the Green Party were won over in Germany. So to me, this is this fascinating thing of the impulse towards anti-war, the thing that makes you put down the sword, this desire, that recognition, say, that we should actually have enough caring for people who are far away and look different from us, not to go and kill them and take their stuff, which is, maybe that's not an idea that has always been through human history. I don't think chimpanzees necessarily have that kind of moral dilemma when they're going off and having wars with all the little tribes of chimps. But we have that in some way, and it comes through in all sorts of religious sentiment and like brothers in Christ, or all the kinds of moral philosophy of humans having innate rights. And that at some point then, this wonderful impulse turns toxic, and it makes us pick the sword back up. And now we're going to go on a crusade again. And of course, the imperialists, we're arm in arm now. So that the anti-war people are in some sense co-opted by an extension of their own ideology. And that, I find that kind of fascinating. And Yugoslavia is really the big turning point in that, for coming out of the Cold War and needing a new justification for war that isn't based on fighting the Soviets and national security.
I think you're exactly right. And I think it is interesting to see how, for someone like me who wasn't really paying attention until 3 years ago, or maybe 5 years ago, to see that this really is another chapter of a very long story that in some ways it's not the definitive beginning point, but really started with World War One. And now it's just a continuation. And the one thing that, if you read Justin Raimondo's piece, in the beginning there was Kosovo, what he was writing against then was this new world war, this new Cold War with Russia. Really a continuation of the recreating. The enemy was killed dead with the end of the USSR, but now we've reanimated and recreated it because we need an enemy, and it's going forward towards this World War III. And there's a real thing that you touched on there with the kind of a co-opting of those anti-war forces, right? Because anecdotally speaking, I had this thoroughly enjoyable conversation with a high school friend of mine's dad. We went over, he's got like a bar. My friend has a bar in his backyard. This happened this summer. And so we all go and hang out there on Friday nights. And one night his dad came over, and of course we started talking politics and about the war. And he's more of like, and he's a punk rocker from the 70s, like loves the Ramones, hung out with the Ramones on a tour bus and stuff like that. And he's a liberal, he's a Democrat, more progressive. And he, of course, hated George W. Bush and the war in Iraq and all those kind of things. But we got to talking about Ukraine, and I was wearing my antiwar.com hat, and I'm the peacenik hippie guy. And he's saying, now listen, I know everything about war is bad. Like it's not the politicians that have to go and fight. It's the poor people and things like that. But we have to intervene in this. And war is wrong and it shouldn't happen, but this one we have to. And that's always the line, I'm not trying to rag on him, by the way. It was a really good conversation, even though we disagreed. But
yeah, and I think it has shocked people in Europe, because there's almost this sense in Europe of it being a little fortress, where we have pushed violence to the outside now, and we've gotten over our history. So I think it affronts that sense people have, like Putin's ruined that. He smashed up Europe.
Right.
And yeah, we do have this, there is something that I think overwhelms our rational impulse, and it just goes into something very instinctual and tribal about, I am being threatened with violence now, even though it's like thousands of miles away. Like I'm being, so I know that every other war has been wrong, but this one, I'm actually not running on my rational analysis. I'm running on my tribal instinct to pick up a spear and defend. And that's because there is this reversion back to that, and that's how war is able to reinvent itself, even amongst people who are cynical about all the other wars.
Right. Yeah. And
I think it's quite right what you say about James Corbett on his World War One documentary, put it quite poetically, we are living in the smouldering crater of World War One. And I think that's quite true. It does seem like this point around which history pivots, and where there was a real choice, right? That didn't have to happen. Britain didn't have to get involved. Russia didn't have to mobilize. The whole thing could have just not happened, and we'd be living in a completely different world. But it set off forces with ultimately the Nazis and then the Soviet Russia, that by the time that wound down, you could say World War One really ended in the 90s with the fall of the Berlin Wall, but there's been such huge juggernauts of military industrial complexes grown up through, if you think about it that way, like what would that be? A nearly 80-year war. Now it's unstoppable. Now this juggernaut, we can't go back to the world of the late 19th or the mid 18th and 19th century of like where classical liberalism was on the ascendancy. We've created a monster.
It really is just a giant tragedy. I mean, and Justin talking about how this is predicting, this new Cold War with Russia and China, and doing it at the end of the 90s as he was, and saying that this ultimate final clash is the thing that antiwar.com was started to prevent. And now you get the sense of fate in history, and I get goosebumps when I think about it, how this is that final moment, or at least we're flirting with it. It feels like it, it's just incredible. And another thing I wanted to mention too, that you kind of keyed on, was this new arms race that's happening. And we see nations like Japan being basically turned into an extension of the U.S. military itself. I mean, when Japan is rearmoring, and that in a sense is being celebrated by the United States, you have to know that something is really, the United States took over Japan essentially and imposed a constitution on it, and it was written in the constitution that Japan cannot have an aggressive military force, or basically much of a military force at all. And now we're just discarding that. And I think that very fact should be alarming to everyone.
It's actually always been a bit of a myth about Japan not having a military. I didn't know this until I researched Japan for a series I was doing, looking at the origins of the US empire. And what I was looking at really was how Theodore Roosevelt co-opted Japan to encourage them to be an empire in the Far East, right? Maybe you consider them West, I don't know. But so using them as a proxy force to stop Russian intervention into China. And that's what the Russo-Japanese War was about. So the British allied with Japan too. And that was really breaking a precedent in Britain at the time, because they didn't like entangling alliances. And for the US, it was impossible. So to go before Congress and suggest an entangling alliance at that point. So Theodore Roosevelt engaged in secret diplomacy, because the big prize is always China. It's always the Chinese markets. And they'd taken the Philippines with the idea of controlling the sea lanes out to China. And Japan was going to be the proxy force that kept the Russians out. And then Japan got above itself and thought that they were going to be a real empire in the Far East. And that then comes into the Second World War, where they had to be disciplined. And then they went back to being kind of an ally. But the actual thing Japan does is it spends 1% of its GDP. It was limited to 1% of its GDP on the military, but 1% of the Japanese GDP is a really big number, because they're very economically successful. And it still puts them inside having one of the top 10 biggest militaries in the world. And they do a lot of euphemisms. So they won't have tanks. They'll have armored personnel vehicles with gun mounted on it or something. They have a lot of euphemisms to cover up for. There is definitely a reluctance in the Japanese population to engage in warfare, but they do have always had a more substantial military than it's been credited for. And it's not surprising that the US would swing back into an alliance with Japan, and maybe one day in another 50 years we'll see them getting too big and it'll swing back again. There'll be conflict between the US and Japan, because the US can't exert enough of its own to really control East Asia. So they need a proxy force there, but the proxy force goes out of control every now and then.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad that you can clarify that for me too. I guess what I'm referring to is, it may very well be that it's a misconception that Japan was disarmored after World War II. I guess what I'm specifically referring to is the inflated, or the enlarged military budget that's, I think, has been approved in Japan just this week. Now,
right, I don't know. Right,
but I don't know how much of an enlargement that is in the general context of post World War II. But I was assuming that it is a large step. But I guess I'm wrong about that.
No, it could well be. It could well be they're going above 1% of GDP. I mean, I imagine that would be very much to the liking of weapons manufacturers. If Japan was going to suddenly spend 2% of GDP in its military, that would be, a big boost to Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all the rest.
Yeah, I should have that. Dave DeCamp just talked about it yesterday on antiwar.com news. So it's up there, but the details kind of evade me. But there really is too, the specter of Hitler too that's been brought out, like it is carted out all the time, but it still is there, because there's this founding, there's this huge generational myth in the United States that, World War II was the just war. And I suppose you grew up in the UK, I assume, right?
Yeah.
So, and I mean, I'm sure over there growing up, there's the huge mythos of, the proper role. I mean, I can't tell you how large that is a part of at least my generation growing up, is venerating World War II and putting it on that pedestal.
Yeah, I'm actually just outside the UK, but it's same kind of education.
Oh, okay.
And interestingly, World War One, by the time I got to high school, was very criticizable. Okay, there was a kind of anti-war movement in the 60s. A lot of left-wing academics came in, and World War One was like presented to us as a great disaster. From what I understand, World War One does not loom as large in the American psyche, anything like as much as World War Two.
You're right, yeah.
But World War Two, definitely, absolutely the justification. And it really takes on mythic proportions, I think, where Hitler becomes kind of like Satan for a post-Christian age. So who he was as a man, that no one even goes there. It's just and every time someone does something bad,
you're not
right. The comparison is Hitler.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about Putin level bad or Pol Pot level bad. I'm talking about like some woman kicked a cat and they got on the news a while ago, and she was considered to be worse than Hitler. So it's just like you can see that this is a mythology that we've imbued, and obviously very disconnected from history. Well, World War II is this weird period where the United States seems to have gone to war on behalf of the Soviet Union to turn China communist and give Stalin Eastern Europe. So it's bizarre.
This other thing I wanted to kind of touch on too, I've had this thought that so objectively speaking, as objective as you can get, many experts are warning that we are closer to nuclear war now than at any point since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Biden has said that. But there are others who have said that we are closer to nuclear war now than we were even during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that would make us closer to nuclear war now than since, I don't know, we actually dropped nuclear bombs on Japan. We as in me are, Americans. But there's this general sense, right, that there's just a lack of consciousness and awareness among the general American population, and maybe you can give your side of it, that we're that close. And one of the things is my grandfather was part of the National Guard in the Civil Defense Force in the United States, and my grandma just gave me a whole manila envelope full of pamphlets and handouts that he got, educating the public about the risk of nuclear war, saying where all of these fallout shelters were. There were millions of fallout shelters in Wisconsin, the state where I live, and instructions on making home fallout shelters and what to do. And there's the tuck and cover and all that stuff. It's so absent right now, and I wonder what was the reason why it was injected so powerfully into the public consciousness during the Cold War, and it's absent now, and why is that?
Yeah, it's interesting, because the one thing you can say is that it's absent. Like, obviously I wasn't walking around in 1960s and through to the 80s, but it seems to be something people were like really concerned about. And Scott Horton did some interesting interviews a few months ago with someone involved in the nuclear efforts to de-escalate the nukes in the 80s, and talking about how Ronald Reagan really came on board with that idea, and the limitation treaties that were put in were very effective and really could have gone all the way. That fear seems to be gone from the public consciousness, and maybe it's just an apathy that it hasn't happened, so it's not going to happen, but it's not there in the same way. And there isn't this active push that, hey, we should be moving to a nuclear-free world. That just doesn't seem, is definitely an apathy around that. Now, is that an engineered apathy? Was the hype around it in the 60s and 70s, was that also engineered? I don't know. I know that, I can't think of the film's name, but there was a film produced in Britain that was actually banned from TV trials. It was considered too disturbing of what Britain would look like if nukes started landing. And I think that
I watched that.
Yeah, I think there was an effort by the government to suppress it because there was a strong, precisely because there was a strong anti-nuclear movement in Britain, and they thought it would add to it. And they want the American nukes out, and these things are too dangerous to keep around.
And I know that in my time in Germany, at least there's a huge anti-nuclear movement in Germany. I think it focuses more on nuclear power plants, but I don't know if it also shares the same. I guess I don't know how much of a nuclear armed state Germany is, if they have any nukes or if they're just in the nuclear sharing program with the United States. I
think it's just they don't have any independently. I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine the US houses them there.
And I would imagine too that, or at least you would hope or think that the anti-nuclear movement in Germany would object to that and actively be working against NATO storing, or the US storing nuclear missiles in Germany. Yeah, it's interesting. So, well, hey, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I'm going to have you back on again to tackle another topic.
I'd be delighted. I would be delighted to. Well, just on the nuclear point. Before we go, I would feel remiss if I didn't mention the NATO bombing of Serbia, Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo used depleted uranium, uranium shells, and that's caused. I mean, I don't think anyone can come close to estimating the destruction that causes, and also the destruction of the infrastructure. But there were around 500 civilians directly killed by NATO bombing, and there's an estimate of like 10,000 deaths from cancer since then in the area. So I would feel remiss not mentioning that, and it sort of fits in well with this question of nuclear and so on. So similar to Iraq, on a smaller scale than Iraq, but similar. Yeah, it's a real problem in Serbia now. Yeah, of course. No, and is there anything else that you wanted to make sure you brought up before we take off? No, I don't think so. I think maybe I don't know if you put book recommendations in the comments, but I would say this is one area where I don't think there's one book you can read to understand Yugoslavia, because in addition to it being an imperial project to dismantle Yugoslavia, everyone has a perspective, and there's a lot of ethnic tensions going on. But I would recommend documentaries like Weight of Chains, Michael Parentini's book To Kill a Nation, to get a particular kind of left-wing perspective. For the economics, there's actually a lot of good articles on Mises.org looking at the economics and the role of the IMF in the breakdown of Yugoslavia. Yeah, I really I appreciated the To Kill a Nation and getting the left-wing perspective on it. But I was thinking, and I haven't read any of the Mises articles, but I was thinking, well, I wonder, how much of this is due to the lending boom. How much of that's where I find agreement between left and right. Yeah, the lending boom and the IMF, because left and right might dislike the IMF for different reasons. So the left dislike it because it cuts social spending, and the right dislike it because it increases taxes. But there's an agreement that the IMF was terrible for Yugoslavia. Yeah, and so hopefully that's common ground to find a way to go forward to oppose these kind of measures. So, well, do you want to tell the audience where they can find your work? Yeah, thank you. So my website is deepstateconsciousness.com, and the podcast is the Deep State Consciousness Podcast. So it's called that. So that's a sticking together of the term deep state to refer to deep political state. And I also do some metaphysical stuff about the nature of consciousness. So that just to stick those two things together. So it was kind of a play on those words. And as I mentioned, I'm doing a series on sort of geopolitical history of the 20th century. I'm going to be doing some stuff looking at the concept of humanitarian intervention. I put anarchism out now and then. So I know people's ears are full of the multitude of different podcasts, but I do, people would consider subscribing. Really appreciate that. Makes it worthwhile my efforts. So yeah, that's where you can find me, deepstateconsciousness.com. Do you have are you on YouTube and Odyssey and stuff like that? Yeah, all those things. So the website has a link to all the different platforms I'm on, but it should be on any podcatcher. If you type in the Deep State Consciousness Podcast, it should come up. And and then YouTube and Odyssey and Rumble, BitChute, all of those. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good. And I have to apologize because I neglected to include Deep State Consciousness on the video version here. It just says The Darkened Hour. But The Darkened Hour, I do that with Adam. So I put the Darkened Hour stuff onto Deep State Consciousness as well. But the Darkened Hour, I do join Adam, and that's a bit more in depth. I try and do my stuff. I try and do everything that if I was having a conversation with someone down the pub, that's the level I'm going for. Whereas Adam, it's like just, you're off the deep end there. Yeah. All sorts of nuance about 9/11. Yeah, no, I love it. So, okay, well, thanks for joining me, Richard, and we look forward to next time. Thank you very much, Patrick. It's great.